Hello, good morning. I'm Dilip Thakore, editor of EducationWorld. I have the honor and privilege today to do a one-on-one interview with one of our leading academic, legal, and liberal arts scholars, Dr. C. Raj Kumar, who's the Vice Chancellor of the Jindal Global University. Just a quick intro of Raj. He has a string of degrees, a wonderful CV. He's an alumnus of Madras, Delhi, Oxford, Harvard universities, with teaching experience in City University of New York, Hong Kong University, and then he returned to India to pursue his dream to start the O.P Jindal Global University in Sonipat, Haryana, which is about 1.5 hours drive from Delhi. This was in the year 2009. Since then, in a very short while, Raj has established Jindal Global University into top-ranked private liberal arts university. It's ranked number 4 by EducationWorld among private universities in India. And more important, it's ranked number 1 by QS, that's Quacquarelli Symonds, which is the originator of the World University Rankings. In their QS ranking, Jindal Global University is ranked number 1 private university in India. Currently, JGU has about 10 schools. Am I right, Raj?
Correct.
10 schools. And over 9,000 students?
More like 6,500 students.
6,000. And how many faculty?
Over 650 faculty.
600 faculty. And what's more important, they have the most international faculty of any university in India. So welcome, Raj. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you for spending the time. I know you're a very busy man. And therefore, thank you very much for spending the time. And let's get on with this. So let me pose my first question to you. I have to just, 1 second. There we go. During the COVID-19 induced lockdown of industry, business, and the academy over the past 5 months, JGU has been very active on social media. The university has reportedly conducted over 750 webinars, and you yourself have anchored over 200 webinars on issues related to school and higher education reform. What was the motivation of getting on the web so earnestly, and what are the outcomes of this online brainstorm?
Thank you very much, Dilip. And it's indeed my pleasure to be here, particularly to be having this discussion with you. I've always admired the work of EducationWorld, not only as an interesting magazine, but also its thought leadership that it has provided in very rigorously and dispassionately, but most importantly, objectively engaging on issues related to education. And thank you very much personally for also your own contribution towards understanding the public policy and governance aspects of higher education, universities. And it's always a pleasure to have this conversation with you. This date. So since you asked this question over another discussion, I have found a little bit more data. So as a university, we are now going deep into this, but as a university, if I look at my faculty members, myself and centers, institutes, we have together done more like 1,000 plus webinars. And this basically in the last 6 months only. And you are right that I have done a larger portion of that in that sense. But the point which I want to say is that it's an extraordinary situation, Dilip. I think the entire world of higher education has been challenged so powerfully that most of us did not know how to deal with it. Very abruptly, in the month of March, we had to suspend classes temporarily. And as a residential university campus, all our students had to leave the campus. And we pretty much were literally groping in the dark for almost a week or so. And very quickly, we adapted to that new situation. And so there were 5 things dominant in my own mind as to what we should be doing. The first was the question that I asked myself was that how do we ensure that the learning and the educational enterprise that we began goes uninterrupted despite the global public health crisis and the global pandemic? That was the first thing I was thinking. The second is, how do we ensure that the intellectually engaging and vibrant environment that we have on campus can be replicated somewhat in an ecosystem where physical classes and physical seminars and conferences will not happen? The third is, how do we make that intellectually engaging experience in the online format more interesting and also more engaging, but hopefully more inspiring? The fourth was, how do we continue to build the global engagement? That is something which we have always committed to, and in the online format. And the fifth is,
keep the bigger debate going on education so that it doesn't go off the radar.
Yes. The fifth was the question of how do you ensure that we connect with the students and the faculty. These 5 elements were dominant in the thought process, and that is how we began doing those webinars. And if you see, it ended up focusing on 3 major elements. One was the focus on education in its broadest forms and manifestations, including school education that we do together, but also higher education and issues surrounding it. The second was the major issues relating to law, public policy, international affairs, journalism, architecture, banking, management, the whole range of our 10 different schools. And the third was what we ended up doing in the form of faculty development workshops and research seminars that we were advancing. All these 3 elements converged. So it's been an absolutely fantastic experience. Now what is happening is, very interestingly, many of those webinars are now moving beyond webinars and are being converted as we speak to research projects. Some of them are moving into publications, particularly conferences and seminars that we conducted over the online format. And the third is, since we have recorded it, they are also becoming an important tool for future learning and capacity building.
So you feel you are satisfied with the outcome of this initiative?
Not only we are satisfied, but we are very profoundly surprised by the way it has been taken by people. Like, for example, since the web format allows you to record it automatically, we put it up in our YouTube, and let's say live format, if we end up having, say, 600 to 1,000 people watching us live, within a few weeks, over 25,000 and sometimes even up to 50,000 have ended up watching that. Now, you and I know that no physical format of engagement can reach out to such diversified set of people in both geographical locations and the context in which they are present. So we are very, very excited about what has happened.
And of course, it's done a lot for your image also of the university.
Thank you so much.
Anyway, congratulations. My second question, Raj, is despite the lockdown in the recently commenced new academic year, JGU has got off to a great start with reported the highest number. I don't have the exact number, but the highest number of admission application against your budgeted annual intake of, you tell me the figure.
Yes.
Is that correct? What factors do you attribute the rising popularity of JGU?
Yeah, so we are very, very fortunate, Dilip, that at a time when both Indian academic institutions and universities around the world are facing a lot of crises. First, I will tell you the broad numbers. Law school is, as you know, our first and oldest school in our university. In law school, I'll talk enrollment. Applications are not necessarily a good indicator sometimes because you get a lot of applications and then people may not join. So I'll give you actual enrollment. We have ended up seeing a 70% rise in the actual student enrollment in the law school. And we have seen a 50% rise in the actual student enrollment in the overall university. Obviously, the law school...
Over the last 1 year, you're saying?
That's correct, yes. So from last year to this year, we have seen an extraordinary increase in the people who have actually. Now, I won't say we didn't entirely predict this, but because our own projections were looking at similar figures for the future. But what was interesting is the COVID-19 crisis has at least not adversely impacted us when it comes to attracting the best of the students from across India and around the world.
Raj, the admission figure, the application figure is very important because it means for every seat that you have.
Application figures is, I'll tell you, application figures is at least 10 times more in the law school and 5 times more in the other schools. So in terms of applications also, we have never seen such a largest number of applications in ever before in the last 11 years across schools and programs.
And this is for the year beginning, academic year beginning?
It has already begun on 1st of September. Our new academic session for 2020 has already begun for all schools.
2021, that is.
Yes. It's 2020, 2021. Yeah.
Yes. And as yet, any indication when you're actually going to invite students on campus? What's the...
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. So I will quickly say, I will attribute 3 things for this trend that we have seen. First of all, as you know, we are a very strong undergrad institution. While we have master's degrees in many schools and PhD programs, we strongly believe in the vision of reimagining Indian undergrad education. I mean, you and I know this. We've been talking about it for years together. If we don't have a strong foundation of high quality, world-class undergrad education, we can never have good quality master's education, let alone high quality PhD, which ultimately lead to potentially academics and professors joining our university. So our strength is 90% of our student community is undergrad. Second is that we took a decision long ago that we remain a non-STEM, non-medicine university. At a time when Indian institutions are dominated by engineering colleges and STEM disciplines and medicine, and I have nothing against it, we took a call that our focus will be in liberal arts, humanities, social sciences, and professional schools such as law and architecture. The closest we have gone in that direction is architecture, but other than that, we are strongly humanities and social sciences focused institution. And the third thing because of which is that we didn't have to invest in laboratories as opposed to human beings. Our focus has been on hiring the best minds from wherever they are, and that helped us fulfill the internationalization agenda as well. I mean, in some ways, this situation has also happened because of the fact that at a time when global pandemic is happening, students and parents are conscious of the fact that they want to go to an institution that can adapt to the crisis better. They can have, let's say, freedom and flexibility and innovation and adaptability when it comes to online education and digital learning. And they also want to be in a campus environment potentially where it is safe and secure and health and well-being of the students is paramount. We have an absolutely fantastic health center. Now we have equipped it and upgraded it more. The campus ecosystem is also very appealing for students, including accommodation, all of that. Now, of course, you asked a very important question. The answer is entirely based upon the changing situation with regard to the COVID-19 crisis. As of now, the situation is such that the government of India has pretty much disallowed schools, colleges, and universities to be open. Even when that scenario changes, we'll have to see to what extent the situation with regard to residential university campuses like us. It's one thing to have a day college situation, but it's a totally different thing to have a fully residential campus environment. The third is, of course, that the social distancing norms. I mean, you know this very well. I have always maintained universities are anti-social distancing. They are anathematic to the very idea of social distancing. So to be able to meaningfully implement social distancing norms in an undergraduate community or even lower in schools, it's going to be almost impossible to be able to do that.
No, so the moot point is that despite students being, despite students not knowing when they actually you will open, they have applied for admission, right?
Oh, absolutely. No, they applied and admitted and classes have begun. So that process
So,
was
yes,
continued.
but they're learning like they would if they were at the university.
That's exactly right. So
Yes.
we have got the entire schedule. We have completed the first week of classes now. We have a tradition in our university where every class, every school's new program will begin with a commencement lecture. We completed 15 commencement lectures last week alone. All classes are as per schedule with teaching allocation, sections allocated. Of course, unfortunately, they are all happening on
Online.
Microsoft Teams and Zoom and all of that.
So let me go to the third question. As I mentioned in the intro, JGU is ranked India's #1 private university of 2021 in the World University Ranking League Tables of QS, which is highly reputed. In fact, they're the pioneers of the WUR. This is done in less than 10 years. About 10 years, right? Since you started, 11 years.
Right.
So what's your comment? How do you explain it? I mean,
while we are very happy with the fact that we are ranked #1 private university in India in the QS World University Rankings, my own institutional aspiration is to be #1 in the Education World Rankings. It's a bit like in India, first you have to get the Nobel Prize to get the Bharat Ratna. So we hope that the education world also recognizes us at some point of time as India's #1 private university. But Dilip, all of us have our own views on rankings. I'll be very candid with you.
Yes.
When we started off in the year 2009, it was never part of our consideration. But what was always the case is we will do, again, 5 things from day one. We will hire the best of the faculty members from India and around the world. We will create the most outstanding interdisciplinary curriculum, courses, programs, which will enable our students to get the best of the opportunities. Third, we will build the most amazing international partnerships and collaborations with universities around the world. 4, we will internationalize our faculty and recruit faculty members from around the world. 5, we will have the most outstanding and inspiring ecosystem that will attract the best students, where learning on campus in classes and learning outside classes will help. This is what we set out to do, and we began to do it from day one. After almost 5 years of doing this, I would say around 2013, we became very conscious of the discourse that was prevailing in the country. In fact, people like you have talked about it, but before that, no less than the President of India, the Prime Minister of India, the earlier Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and the current Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and before that, the previous President, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who left us recently, they were lamenting about the fact that not a single Indian university is among the top 100 in the world, and very few are in the top 200 or 500, and we need to really introspect. So
even to this day, right? Even today,
yes, correct, absolutely. So the discourse in the country was, and I was very surprised to see a sharp divide. And again, I'll be very candid with you. I was very surprised to see that many IIT directors were dismissing international rankings. They were saying that rankings do not reflect, we should not be bothered about international rankings, we should not be caring about international rankings. The ridiculousness of the discourse sometimes moved into the stage where these are Western conspiracies to undermine India and all of that. But at the same time, a lot of sane voices were also emerging, particularly from the President of India and the Prime Minister of India, both the former
politicians, which is unusual.
Exactly. They were actually pushing the boundaries and challenging and exhorting. In fact, I remember President Pranab Mukherjee and Prime Minister Modi have spoken in numerous forums, including in convocations of universities. If you track down, they were speaking in one voice that we need to do something about it. Now, of course, after pushing that a lot, then the regulatory bodies and some government agencies began to slowly respond. And that birth of that response led to reforms that began to happen, including autonomy for IIMs, graded autonomy, and culminating in the Institute of Eminence policy. But before I go into all of that, I will say this was inspiring for us. So we began sometime around 2013-14 to go deep into the rankings methodology. We were trying to understand what these rankings are. And very quickly, I realized we spoke to a number of people, and I'll tell you something quite interesting happened. Anybody who I spoke in India were dismissive of the rankings. They said, you should not bother about it. You should forget it. You are doing fine.
That's Indian exceptionalism.
Right. And when I spoke to people abroad, my friends, they were also slightly skeptical about our own situation because, and they were right. They said, listen, the rankings favor old universities. It always, you will not find universities rarely less than 25, 30, 40, 50 years old. And the really top ones are always 200, 100, 300, 400. Second, they said rankings favor STEM disciplines. You will hardly find non-STEM and non-medicine type. All of that is true. And so you should not. So then, you know, when I receive a lot of skepticism and, you know, almost dismissal, that led my curiosity to be part of it more. So we really put in place and went deep into this methodology and started to work hard, doing exactly what we did before. But then we were beginning to see the results for it. By 2016, we were actually seeing what we were doing was being impacted. People were talking about our university.
So that in the university, you set up an actual cell.
Absolutely. So by a few years ago, we set up what is known as the Office of Rankings, Benchmarking, and Institutional Transformation, calling it Orbit. Orbit. The idea, the vision of Orbit was to help JGU build capacity to participate effectively in global rankings and benchmarking exercises with a view to collecting data, develop, and we also separately created an institutional research unit, whereby, because, you know, one of the big things that we saw, it's not so much that Indian institutions, while there is a lot of mediocrity, you and I know that there are very good institutions in India. But the reality is, even them were not effectively participating in this exercise.
That's because most academics don't know anything about marketing, advertising, public relations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And well, one thing is not knowing much, but unfortunately, many of them are outrightly dismissive of it. That makes it much worse. It's
yes.
You know, ignorance is bliss. I can understand, but to actually say that this is, and I tell them that, listen, I mean, Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Oxford and Cambridge, they do create brands and they promote their brands. It's not like they're just languishing themselves because they're already on top of the world. So anyway, to cut the story short, I will say we created a sharper focus towards ranking exercises purely by effective data collection and, most importantly, doing all the things more of what we did from day one.
Yes. Okay, let's now move to, you know, away from.
I want to quickly tell you one exercise on this, because you should know the evolution. The first time we broke into rankings we broke into the QS BRICS rankings. BRICS is a relatively smaller group, 9,000 universities. We broke into the top 350 in the world. That gave us aspiration. That was 3 years ago. Later, we broke into QS Asia rankings, which has 13,000 universities, and we were top 400. It gave us more confidence. Then last year in 2020, quite remarkably, we broke into the QS World Universal Rankings. At that time, we were not number 1 private, 18 public and 6 were private. We were one of only 24 Indian universities among the 1,000 Indian universities to be ranked by QS. They only ranked 1,000. And that was already a big deal. But we continued our work and Orbit began to do more. And this year, quite remarkably, the total number of Indian universities got shrunk. There were only 3 private and 18 public. 24 became 21 from India. competition was coming out from Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taipei, Malaysia, China, and parts of Middle East. Indian contribution shrunk, but we not only became India's #1 private university, we jumped 100 ranks from top 800 in the world to top 700 in the world.
Wow, congratulations. Well done. So now let's move away from Jindal University. To the new education policy, which is all big news currently everywhere. In several media essays and statements, you have welcomed the new education policy 2020. Why is that? What are its positive features in your opinion?
So, let me say one thing. The most academics have actually welcomed the new education policy in a very interesting manner, particularly with regard to higher education. I will confine my comments on higher education because there's a whole different set of discourse happening in the school education sector. So I'll say, first and foremost, Dilip, one of the things which is less talked about is that the NEP has a vision. Rarely policy documents created by government organizations, including ministries, starts with a vision and an aspiration. And the vision and aspiration is so beautifully created in the early paragraphs itself. We want to build a world-class education system. A world-class, and these words are used because we were very reluctant to use these words before. Because world-class means there is a quality standard, there is an excellence dimension, there is an aspiration. The second thing I liked about the NEP is that it has boldly talked about regulatory reforms. We'll talk about it in detail. I know you have some views on that, but it talks about the regulation being tight and yet sharp. And the point light and tight. They use the word light and tight. So that means that 2-3 things comes out of it. A, they recognize that there is a problem in regulation. B, they also recognize that the existing regulatory framework has created a lot of obstacles and bottlenecks to do things. And third, they actually are talking in terms of we need to change the regulation to reform. I will go a step further. The foundations of the NEP had already been laid in the last 3 years. First by the autonomy that was created for IIMs. Never before in the history of India, a sitting government body has decided to relinquish its existing powers in the board and empower an organization. One can debate about whether that was how it was done or whatever, but they took a decision that no longer the government, ministers and others will be in the IIM board. Second was a very important policy initiative called graded autonomy regulation. Again, 2 years ago it was done, where 52 Indian universities out of the 1,000 universities on the basis of the NAC accreditation and NAC rating were given autonomy. Of course, again, we can debate about what does it mean. It was never clear. Once you get the autonomy, what are the consequences? That's, of course, the last mile implementation problem in India, which we will talk about. The third was a really progressive, transformative initiative on the question of Institute of Eminence, promoted no less than by the Prime Minister of India, which, of course, China did 30 years ago, Russia did 10 years ago, Japan did a few years ago, and we are doing it. But the vision is very clear. We identified 10 public and 10 private universities, give them support for the public in terms of money and private in terms of autonomy, and help them propel to become world-class universities. This vision was also reflected in the new education policy. The third element of the NEP, which I liked about, is that a strong recognition. We don't know how it's going to happen. You need a lot of money. A strong recognition that investment, GDP investment in resources, in terms of financial investment, creation of a stronger impetus to raise resources has been mentioned. We can talk again about Whether that will happen, not happen, that's separate. The fourth big thing in the NEP was, NEP talks about a research ecosystem. It talks about a research funding model. Again, one can talk about the implications of it, but the idea of a national research foundation, particularly on the hard sciences. Because honestly, Dilip, being member of a private university, I can tell you, if you really want to support hard sciences in areas of STEM disciplines and advanced sciences, rarely anywhere in the world, including in private universities in the United States, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Caltech, it's government funding. Government is the largest contributor because government generally has certain long-term interests in mind, which private enterprises may not afford and may not have that. So the idea of a national research foundation is a good idea if implemented in the right manner. That's the fourth thing. And the
fifth, as a funding agency, right?
As a funding. Exactly. Yeah. That's a major challenge on the regulatory part of it. We'll come back. And the fifth, I'm only giving you 5 major items. The fifth item, in my view, is that a strong recognition of internationalization and digitization when it comes to the future of it. This whole thing is embedded on certain important values, and that's very important. The values are multidisciplinary education, liberal education, pursuit of excellence, promotion of expansion with quality and access, and governance and leadership. These are part of the cross-cutting themes on the basis of which, and of course, the NEP has talked about academic freedom, institutional autonomy, all of that. Now, yes. I will also say what it has not done, if you permit me.
I will come to that. I'm going to ask you about that later. But what I want to ask you now, isn't it rather ominous that for privately promoted university like JGU, that the 65-page National Education Policy 2020 document makes almost no reference to private sector education institutions, except to state that the public needs to be protected from their commercial and exploitative practices. Doesn't this reflect a certain mindset which is perhaps contradictory to what you've been saying right now?
It's a fair question, Dilip. Let me answer this. To be fair to that report, there was a very important mention that quality and excellence will not be measured only on the basis of public and private. So there was a very important reference about a recognition that private university, if you are going to measure quality and excellence, it should not be differentiated on the question of public or private. It has been, yeah. So that's because for many of us, we feel discriminated. Private is pejorative. We have suffered that for long. So that part of it gave us some, I would say, as a sort of a sombering reflection that it at least recognized that. But I entirely agree with you. If there is one major element that should have captured the NEP's imagination, is the role of the private sector in higher education. I'll tell you why. Not only for the reason you mentioned. The data is very important here. I was surprised to know, and I did that research recently, 70% of Indian higher education institutions are located in the private sector.
Exactly.
0. And second, which is even more interesting, one is number of institutions. Second, 70% of higher education students are also studying in private higher education, which means there has been a tectonic shift in the last decade alone. This was not the case a decade ago. This tectonic shift has led to today both private higher education institutions in terms of numbers and higher education students studying in institutions in terms of student numbers. The private sector is dominating.
Let me add to that, that also 47% of all school-going children are in private education.
I know. So, it's a huge...
in the light of that, I mean, I detect a thread of anti-private education prejudice throughout the document. So isn't that a bit disturbing for people like you are, yourself, and others like yourself, that no, it's totally disregarded. Whatever reference that's made is, as you say, it's a pejorative, you know.
I will slightly be a little more optimistic, and I'll tell you why I am. First of all, I would say the school education, I agree with you. It's much harsher on school education, private sector. But the higher education, private sector, it's a more nuanced. It does not actually openly discriminate, nor does it openly promote. It actually has a more nuanced, almost muted silence in most parts of it. But the reality is, you can't avoid the reality. 70% of universities, colleges are private, and 70% of students. Second reality is the government doesn't have money. The reality is today, the government, state or central, does not have the money to set up institutions, nor to actually pay for salaries and infrastructure and all of that. So it's actually
particularly since this COVID crisis.
COVID-19 has actually elevated the crisis into a significantly almost irredeemable proportion. Because if our economy, as people say, I don't even understand those things, where it's 21% down, I don't understand where we will get all of this resources for it. So I agree with you, but I would like to see a bit of hope here, because given the fact that there is bias and prejudices deeply embedded in the civic and political and educational culture of our country for the last several decades, change of any kind cannot come radically. Change will come to India in a measured manner, and we need to constantly nudge and fight and persuade and engage to acquire more and more space, which is what you and I do.
Yes. Okay. Let me move on now, Raj. One of the important thing that's happened, important proposals in NEP 2020 is the unbundling of the multiple powers of the University Grants Commission. NEP envisaged the establishment of over a dozen supervisory bodies: HECI, NHERC, GEC, HEGC, NAC, PSBB, etc., to monitor and regulate higher education institutions. Isn't this, to me, this seems like a runaway bureaucratization? What's your comment?
Yeah. Well, Dilip, there is a very important regulatory dilemma, Dilip. And we have to accept that. And you are a very thoughtful public policy person. What is the regulatory dilemma? The regulatory dilemma is as follows. At one end of the spectrum, even today, there are absolutely fraudulent, mediocre, even fly-by-night, dubious, corrupt higher education providers, including organizations which don't pay to their faculty and staff. They collect cash-based fee from students. They don't maintain any proper books. They engage in all kinds of dubious transactions. I mean, we have to accept that. You and I have, and I would go a step further. The pejorativeness that is currently prevailing in the society at large for private institutions traces back to these institutions. There are two things happening. One is government has slowly, very slowly, I mentioned about the graded autonomy. What have they done in graded? In fact, another very good example will be the day before yesterday, you should look at those regulations. UGC and MHRD has passed a Gazette notification on online degree programs. In all of this, if you notice, a new thinking is emerging. You read it carefully. What is that new thinking? The new thinking is, earlier, everybody is a suspect. Everybody is a suspect. Now, all right, autonomy can be earned. So, if you are 3.25 plus in NAC accreditation, if you are top 100 NIRF, if you are top in the QS ranking, or whatever you mentioned, then you get some privileges. It's like a club. Once you enter the club, then others are all aspiring. You can all aspire. You come into top NAC accreditation, we'll give you some freedom. You get this, we'll give you more freedom. So India has quite interestingly. Now it's another matter, and that's where the problem comes. Your fears are legitimate because even after the rules say one thing, if the mindset of people doesn't change, and in fact, in my writings, I have said 5 things are needed if the vision of NEP, including what you just said, can be implemented. First thing I said is building trust. All round distrust between government agencies, regulatory bodies, higher education institutions prevailing today. Second, transparent decision making. Overnight, regulations get passed, we are all told to be implementing. Third, institutional independence, where we empower the institutions. 4, active and participative consultation, which we have not seen before. And 5, strong emphasis on empowering the particular university. If we do these 5, then some of the fears and concerns that you and I have can be addressed, and some of the even loopholes in the NEP can be covered.
So you don't fear any, like you may be spending a lot of time answering to all these bodies rather than doing the job.
I think that the attitude has changed. I strongly believe the government's thinking has changed. It will be earned. It cannot be given automatically. So today we are an institute of eminence. We will get some more privileges than others. If we are an autonomous institution, some others will be more regulated than us. That is the thinking. Now, again, I keep saying, one of the big challenges in India is, despite good thinking, when it comes to implementing policy, we have a challenge.
In my opinion, we need a trust but verified model.
Correct.
Rather than a detailed regulatory model. Do you agree?
I entirely agree with you. And also, trust and verify is one thing. But the second thing I would say is, ultimately, there is a market also that responds. If you are, let's say, a fraudulent today, you must know 5 years ago, in fact, in the last 5 years, some data is emerging. 1,000 business schools have been closed in India. Nobody has asked them to close. They got closed because market does not anymore accept such things.
Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Yes. The next question is, NEP directs the central and state governments to work together to increase investment in public. Work together is in inverted commas. To increase public education, investment in public education to 6% of GDP at the earliest, again in inverted commas. But with the economy having contracted, we touched on that earlier, by 24% in the April-June quarter of 2021 and reeling from the national lockdown, how feasible is government spending to increase government spending for education, for public education to 6% of GDP?
Dilip, this is where I have always maintained we have been consistently getting it wrong. People don't realize world-class education doesn't come cheap. Anything that is of high quality also is expensive. One can debate about who gives the money, but if let's say an IIT is great, it's because it's also expensive. Just as Indians of Science Bangalore is great, it's expensive. One can debate about whether the Tatas are putting in the money, the Jindals are putting in the money, or the state of Karnataka is putting in the money, or the government of India is putting in the money. But the point is, we all have to recognize, and unfortunately, higher education system, particularly the public higher education system, the regulatory bodies, government agencies, even government officials do not sufficiently recognize this. That is where the problem comes. So, even pre-COVID,
that's because they look at the cost the student, the fee the student pays, yes, rather than the cost per student.
Which is very unfortunate, because that's almost like being delusional about the idea of education. I mean, Delhi University, where I studied, I ended up spending, $10 for my law degree. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. But
$10 per year.
Per year. So, I mean, that's so unfair, because I have spent more money for my school education, and I come from a middle class family. But my question is, this is another challenge we have. We need to have a differential fee structure.
No, but the point is the taxpayer has spent not $10 on your education. They spent $1,000.
Exactly. Absolutely. So this is the point I'm saying, which is, and a few years ago, you may have seen that the then Planning Commission had constituted a committee under the chairmanship of Mr. Narayana Murthy. That committee produced a very good report. It's called the Narayana Murthy Committee Report, had very multi-stakeholder model. You know what they recommended? They recommended a 300% tax rebate for investment in education. We have to involve the private sector with huge incentives, because at one level, you don't have, government doesn't have money. At another level, we have disincentivized the private sector who does not want to contribute. And the third level, you have mediocre, dubious, corrupt, fraudulent private sector people coming into education. A toxic mix that results in what we have. So if you really want to upgrade our education system, I for one will believe not only should the private sector be incentivized to create private, not-for-profit, philanthropic higher education institutions, but they should be actually incentivized to contribute to the public education. I mean, the rich people of India should be able to get 200-300% tax rebate to give away to the Delhi University, to the JNU, to the IIT, to the IIM, because besides alumni funding, they also need resources. So,
but isn't that's not the case today? You're a legal man.
Not at all, Dilip. In fact, the disincentives are so high for actually doing anything, because it has created multi-layered framework of, if you are a foundation or a society, at best 50% of the contribution is available for tax rebate. Even then, there are limits imposed. Not what the Narayana Committee Murthy is talking about. We need to create scholarship, for example. A scholarship fund should be created. Anybody who contributes to a scholarship fund should receive a 300% tax rebate. I mean, the less talked about story of America is, fine, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, NYU, Caltech, and Johns Hopkins, and MIT, they're all private. But the reason they have been able to sustain, and their alumni is funded, but why are they funding? Huge tax rebates they get. If you give money for higher education or any what they call as charitable type endeavors, huge tax rebates they get.
So you mean if I gave some money to Delhi University, as per your example, and if I gave them, say, $10,000 equivalent, what tax rebate would I get?
You will get, well, first of all, you will, if you are an individual, you are going to get much lesser than if you do it through an organization. And for an organization, it's much worse because you don't get it automatically. You have to go through the 80G process where the income tax department will formally assess your organization and then determine whether that even 50% tax rebate can be. My view is, why should you even bother about who is giving? If the money is going to that cause, let's say education, whoever is giving that money, whether it's individual or corporate, whatever the recipient, so long as the recipient is a cause, they should automatically get. Why do you need to evaluate the whole process and then determine? Then there are gradations. So, like if you give it to Prime Minister's Relief Fund, you get certain amount. If you give it to All India Medical Sciences, you get it. But if you give it to some other institution nearby, you don't. So there is so complicated set of rules and regulations are prevailing right now.
So that's a disincentive, as you said.
Absolutely.
Yes. So now I think we are approaching the end of our very interesting discussion. I just wanted to, I think you mentioned you wanted to say when I cut you off that what don't you like about the new education policy?
So I strongly believe that there was an opportunity to charter an imagination for the role of private sector in higher education. Yes. I do believe if only they had thought about the fact that 70% of institutions, and by the way, this is going to increase. This number is only going to increase. because for all the reasons we have been talking about. So
Yes.
if you want to prepare a futuristic NEP, then you really need to talk about the role of the private sector, even after government coming in, which itself is doubt in terms of the money that they're going to put in. The role of the private sector is not going to diminish at all. And if that is the case, then why are we not putting it out there as a part of the NEP process? The second thing I would say is that there was a very strong emphasis on research ecosystem. I wish they had mentioned in the research ecosystem the contribution of the private sector and even tax benefits for it, because the big money.
Tax benefits for corporates, you're talking.
Yes, absolutely. See, people talk about academia industry interface, but
Yes.
what is the basis of that interface? It cannot be just like that, the academia industry coming in and funding stuff. It has to be based upon a framework. And I'm not saying they should dictate what has to happen in academia, but they should have incentives. In fact, Amartya Sen in his book Development as Freedom, even he talked about the fact that we should never underestimate the role and importance of incentives to be able to achieve our goals of development. Yeah, absolutely. So, and then that's second and third thing which I would say is, which is not a problem with the policy, but very quickly the implementation plan. Because right now the policy has a beautiful vision, it has an aspiration, but when it comes to detailing, ideally the policy should have accompanied with the implementation plan. But I would like to believe that the government is working hard as we speak on an implementation plan. What is very positive in all of this endeavor is no less than the Prime Minister has convened 3 or 4 major conferences of every stakeholder in the higher education sector, including all vice chancellors. And yesterday they had a meeting of all governors of states and chief ministers. The social and intellectual galvanization of higher NEP is happening, and that's a good thing. I have not had in recent time such strong political message emerging out of the highest echelons of power with regard to NEP. That's a good thing, but it also has an important challenge where high expectations have been created. Now we need to fulfill it.
Last question. Is there a realistic chance, after all this discussion, of a major reform of the country's control and command education system in the medium term? Forget about long term.
I do believe that, Dilip, and maybe I'm an optimist, and I also believe that if you're living in India, you have to be an optimist. I do believe that there is that reform will not come with the speed in which you and I want it. It will also not come in the scale in which you and I want it. But it will be slow and gradual, but you will see pockets of reform happening. And the NEP has actually laid a solid foundation so long as we don't mess it up when it comes to implementing it. The air is available. There is an environment.
You think the Neta Babu brotherhood is going to give away control and command?
Well, I am seeing that trend, and we need to see. It's not only let's also take some responsibility here. Our own higher education institutions also need to rise up to the occasion. At the end of the day, when we have 1,000 universities and 45,000 colleges, we also need to internally develop a critical mechanism. How much all of us are doing what we are doing? Are we rising up to the occasion? Are we building, high standards in what we are doing? Are we doing that cutting edge research that can address problems of our society, problems of science, problems of humanities? Because part of the problem, when you want more power and more autonomy and more freedom, it also comes with more responsibility and more accountability.
Okay, thank you very much. Your last question. Any other general comment you have to make, Raj?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to do, and that's what you are doing, is that the civil society discourse in relation to education should become more dominant. I become very frustrated to see when newspapers and magazines are only interested in sports, Bollywood, and politics, and of course, other things which are much worse. We
Yes.
need to develop a strong discourse as you are promoting through your magazine, through our show, through what we are doing. That discourse has to come to the forefront. And it cannot be always an event. One policy comes, then people talk about it. Education is too important a matter that can be left with only to the educationists.
True. Thank you very much. Excellent interview. Always a pleasure talking to you, Raj. And I wish you the best with your pioneering efforts in the Jindal Global University. And good luck. Let's
Thank you
hope
so
your
much.
optimism pays off.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure talking to you always.